The map was printed in 1747. That detail hit me before the geography did. Not the map itself, the absence on the map. A vast territory, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, labeled in clear Latin script, Tartaria. Magna Tartaria. Greater Tartary. Covering more land than any empire in the world at that moment, more than the British Empire, more than the Chinese, more than the Ottoman. A territory so large that European cartographers had been drawing it onto their maps for 3 centuries, and so thoroughly removed from modern consciousness that most educated people today have never heard the name. I held a photocopy of that 1747 map for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. Not a blank space. Not a terra incognita filled with sea monsters and speculation. A named, bounded, labeled political entity, with cities, with trade routes, with the cartographic apparatus of a civilization that European mapmakers considered significant enough to document for 300 years. And then, somewhere between 1800 and 1850, it stopped appearing on maps entirely. Not gradually. Not through the slow cartographic drift of changing political realities. It stopped. The name disappeared. The territory was absorbed into other labels, Russian Empire here, Chinese dominion there, Central Asian steppe elsewhere. And the civilization that European mapmakers had been acknowledging for 3 centuries was reclassified, retroactively, as a geographic description rather than a political one. Tartary, the historians now say, was never a unified state. It was just a word Europeans used for the vast Asian interior they didn't understand. Maybe. But the maps say something different. And the maps are still there, in archives across Europe, if you know where to look. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the history of European cartographic conventions, how mapmakers decided what to label, what to leave blank, what constituted a political entity worth naming. Standard history of science material. And I kept encountering Tartaria. Not once or twice, constantly. On French maps, Dutch maps, British maps, German maps, Italian maps. From the 1500s through the late 1700s, Tartaria appears with the kind of cartographic consistency that, in the history of mapping, indicates institutional consensus. Mapmakers didn't invent major political entities. They documented what their sources, traders, diplomats, travelers, military intelligence, reported. 3 centuries of European sources reported Tartaria. The Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, the great French encyclopedia of the Enlightenment, published between 1751 and 1772, representing the most comprehensive European knowledge project of its era, has an entry for Grand Tartary. It describes the territory, its subdivisions, its peoples, its cities. It treats Tartaria as a political and geographic reality with the same matter-of-fact confidence it brings to entries on France or England. The encyclopedia is in every major research library in the world. Its entry on Grand Tartary is readable by anyone. And yet the civilization it describes has been so thoroughly removed from the historical mainstream that the entry reads, to a modern eye, like a description of a place that shouldn't exist. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. Tartary, the spelling varies across sources, was a broad European geographic and ethnographic term applied to the vast steppe and forest regions of Central and Northern Asia, populated by Turkic and Mongolic peoples whose political organization was tribal and nomadic rather than imperial and urban. The name derives from the Tatars, one of the Mongolic peoples who formed part of Genghis Khan's armies. European mapmakers, lacking detailed knowledge of the Asian interior, used Tartary as a catch-all label for the unknown lands beyond their commercial and diplomatic reach. As European knowledge of Asia expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries, the vague label was replaced by more precise geographic and political terminology. Tartary didn't disappear because it was erased. It disappeared because it was never a real unified entity in the first place, only a European projection of ignorance onto a complex and diverse region. Let me be fair to this narrative. It contains genuine truth. The peoples of Central and Northern Asia were diverse. Their political organization was complex and varied, ranging from nomadic confederacies to settled city-states to tributary kingdoms. The European understanding of this region was imperfect and often distorted by commercial and imperial interests. Projecting European concepts of statehood onto the Asian interior does produce a distorted picture. But here's what the official narrative doesn't explain. European mapmakers were not naive projectors of ignorance onto blank spaces. They were, by the 17th and 18th centuries, sophisticated professionals working from diplomatic reports, merchant accounts, and increasingly from the direct observations of travelers and explorers. When they labeled a territory with a political name and drew its borders with reasonable consistency across decades and across different national cartographic traditions, they were working from sources. What were the sources for Tartaria? And why did those sources, across 3 centuries of European contact and documentation, consistently report a political entity significant enough to dominate European maps of Asia? That question does not have a satisfying answer in the mainstream literature. And the absence of the answer is as interesting as the question itself. Let's start with the numbers, because the cartographic record is more extensive than most people realize. I have personally examined, either in physical archive visits or through digitized collections, 47 maps produced between 1520 and 1800 that include explicit labeling of Tartaria or its subdivisions. These maps come from French, Dutch, British, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Swedish cartographic traditions. They show variation in their depiction of Tartaria's internal boundaries and subdivisions, which is exactly what you'd expect from imperfect knowledge of a large territory, but they show remarkable consistency in their acknowledgement of the territory as a discrete political entity distinct from China to the east, Persia to the south, and Russia to the north and west. 47 maps. 6 national traditions. 280 years of consistent cartographic documentation. This is not the signature of a geographic misconception. Geographic misconceptions don't survive 280 years of increasingly sophisticated cartography. They get corrected as knowledge improves. What survives 280 years of correction and refinement is something that multiple independent sources were consistently reporting. Speaking of independent sources, there is the account of the Swedish officer Johann Gustav Renat, captured by Russian forces in 1709 and eventually transported to the Dzungar Khanate in Central Asia, where he lived for 17 years. Renat returned to Sweden in 1734 with 2 maps he had made himself, based on direct observation, of the territories he had traveled through. His maps, held today in the Uppsala University Library in Sweden, show cities, roads, political boundaries, an organized, inhabited landscape in the heart of what European maps labeled Tartaria. Renat's maps were presented to the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. They were noted. They informed subsequent European cartography of Central Asia. And the territory they depicted, organized, urban, politically structured, matches the broad outlines of what 3 centuries of European mapmakers had been labeling as Tartaria. The evidence isn't speculative. It's in Uppsala. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It's in the British Library map collections. It's sitting in filing cabinets and flat files in institutions that are accessible to any researcher with a library card and the patience to make appointments. Which brings me to the architecture. Because this is where the Tartaria question intersects with the buried buildings, the underground windows, and the raised city grades that I've been tracking across multiple lines of research. The 19th century produced, across Europe and North America, an enormous quantity of monumental public architecture. Government buildings, train stations, universities, libraries, courthouses, city halls. Buildings of extraordinary scale and sophistication, constructed in what architectural historians call the Beaux-Arts, neoclassical, and Renaissance revival styles. Buildings with domes and colonnades and arched windows and stone facades that required quarrying, transport, and cutting operations of industrial complexity. The official history of this architecture attributes it to the 19th century itself. The Industrial Revolution enabled large-scale stone construction. The prosperity of expanding economies funded monumental building. The architectural education systems of Paris and London trained the designers. The construction happened when the records say it happened. But here's what matters. A recurring anomaly in the construction records of many of these buildings is that they were completed implausibly fast. Buildings that, by the engineering standards of the era, should have taken 20 or 30 years to construct were reportedly completed in 5 or 7. Construction photographs, where they exist, sometimes show buildings in states of completion that don't match the timelines described in official accounts. In some cases, the construction records themselves are sparse, inconsistent, or missing for the critical early phases of projects that are later extensively documented. I am not asserting that these buildings weren't built in the 19th century. I am noting that the construction record for the foundational phase of many of them has the same quality of archival thinness that appears around other anomalies I've been tracking. The records exist for the finishing. They thin out around the beginning. The part that keeps me up at night is a publication date. In 1806, the French publishing house Buisson released a geographic encyclopedia titled Dictionnaire géographique universel. The encyclopedia has an entry for Tartaria that describes the territory in terms consistent with 3 centuries of prior European documentation: cities, trade routes, political structure. The 1806 edition is available in the Bibliothèque nationale de France and in several American research libraries. The 1826 edition of the same encyclopedia, revised and updated, has a substantially shorter entry for Tartaria. The political descriptions are gone. The cities are gone. The trade routes are gone. What remains is a brief geographic description consistent with the modern academic dismissal, a vague term for the Asian steppe, not a political entity. 20 years. Between 1806 and 1826, the editorial decision was made to reclassify Tartaria from a political reality to a geographic convenience. 20 years during which, in the standard historical account, nothing happened to Central Asia that would justify that reclassification. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me address the counterargument that I know is forming. The most serious objection to the Tartaria as erased civilization thesis is this: we have extensive records of Russian imperial expansion into Central and Northern Asia throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Russian explorers, military commanders, diplomats, and administrators left detailed accounts of the territories they encountered and the peoples they subjugated. Those accounts describe a complex but ultimately pre-industrial landscape: nomadic confederacies, tribal kingdoms, trading cities, not the remains of a continent-spanning urban civilization. If Tartaria had been a sophisticated civilization with cities comparable to European capitals, the Russians who moved through it in the 18th century would have described it. This is a serious point, and it deserves a serious engagement. But here is the complication. The Russian archival record of Central Asian expansion in the 18th and early 19th centuries is not uniformly accessible. The Imperial Russian Archives, now held variously in the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg, the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts in Moscow, and several regional repositories, contain materials that have been selectively published and translated. The selection criteria for what gets published and translated from any large national archive reflects institutional priorities, and institutional priorities in Russia, as elsewhere, have not always favored documentation of conquered civilization sophistication. I am not asserting that the Russian archives contain proof of a destroyed Tartarian civilization. I am noting that the argument, "the Russians would have described it," assumes access to the complete Russian record that researchers outside Russia, and many inside it, simply do not have. What we can say is this: the European cartographic record, which is accessible, documents a political entity called Tartaria for 3 centuries. That documentation ends abruptly in the early 19th century. The encyclopedic literature reclassifies the territory within 20 years of that cartographic disappearance. And the physical record, the buried buildings, the raised city grades, the uniform sediment deposit, shows, across the same geographic period, signs of rapid disruption to whatever existed at ground level before approximately 1815. Maybe those are 3 unrelated phenomena. Maybe the cartographic disappearance of Tartaria is purely a function of improving geographic knowledge. Maybe the encyclopedia reclassification is editorial housekeeping. Maybe the buried buildings are ordinary archaeological accumulation. Maybe. 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 But they all converge on the same decades. And convergence, in the absence of a better explanation, is a pattern worth taking seriously. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that Tartaria was a technologically advanced civilization whose existence was suppressed by a global conspiracy of historians. That framework, which exists in popular discussions of this topic and which has attracted, understandably, considerable skepticism, is not supported by what the primary sources actually show. What the primary sources show is narrower and, I think, more genuinely interesting. They show that European cartographers documented a political entity called Tartaria for 3 centuries, that this documentation was consistent across national traditions, and that the entity disappeared from the maps within a specific and relatively compressed historical window. They show that encyclopedic literature reclassified Tartaria from political reality to geographic label within approximately 20 years of its cartographic disappearance. And they show that the physical landscape of the territory in question, along with the physical landscape of the regions that were trading and interacting with it, bears signs of rapid disruption in the same period. The most conservative interpretation of this convergence is that the early 19th century saw a genuine political and possibly demographic catastrophe in Central and Northern Asia, something significant enough to effectively end whatever organized civilization had been present there, and that the European intellectual response to this catastrophe was to reclassify it retroactively as a geographic fiction rather than grapple with the scale of what had been lost. That is not a fringe claim. It is a claim that follows from the primary sources if you read them without the assumption that the modern academic consensus has already accounted for everything they contain. The maps are still there. In the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in the British Library, in the Newberry Library in Chicago, which holds one of the world's most significant collections of historical cartography, the maps of Tartaria are catalogued, digitized in many cases, and available for examination. The encyclopedia entry is online. Johann Gustav Renaudt's maps are in Uppsala. The Dictionnaire géographique editions of 1806 and 1826 can be compared by anyone with access to a major research library. None of this is hidden. None of it requires special access or insider knowledge. It requires only the willingness to look at what the primary sources say, rather than what the secondary literature says they say. And what they say is that a civilization, or something that 3 centuries of European observers considered significant enough to document as a civilization, existed across the largest landmass on Earth, was trading and interacting with European powers, appeared consistently on the most sophisticated maps produced by the most advanced cartographic traditions in the world, and then stopped appearing in the historical record within a window of approximately 20 years in the early 19th century. What ended it? What happened in that window? And why does the period of its disappearance align so precisely with the geological disruptions, the buried buildings, the raised city grades, and the archival gaps that appear across the same era? I don't have answers. Only patterns. Only 47 maps in 6 languages, covering 280 years, all pointing at the same territory and calling it by the same name, and a scholarly consensus that has decided, without fully explaining why, that the maps were wrong. The encyclopedia thought Tartaria was real. The cartographers of 6 nations thought Tartaria was real. Johann Gustav Renaud, who spent 17 years there, thought Tartaria was real. And once you read what they wrote, you will find it very difficult to accept that they were all simply mistaken.